So everyone sees my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Great. Uh, to start off, of course, we have our big question: what are the differences between law and gospel? Uh, we're going to start off by just doing, because you guys at CLC aren't doing the lectionary anymore. You're doing the narrative.
Starting this coming Sunday. Yes.
Oh, so you guys did do the
We
revised
did right. We did the regular lectionary this past Sunday.
Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll go through each reading and we'll dissect what's law, what's gospel, and then we'll try to see what key words will be used and we'll answer our question up here. Okay.
Okay.
So, do we have a volunteer to do the first reading?
Sure.
I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Cheryl, you got it.
I've got it for a change here. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, what portions of this reading from Isaiah would you say is law?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. Well, it's mostly poetry, isn't it?
Yeah, but it has, I mean, this is from the Old Testament. Isaiah, of course, in the Old Testament, it's all law. So from what we looked at last week, what would be highlighted as law?
Say to those, to preach the word of God.
Yeah, that they're being told to do something.
Right.
So you're looking just for like keywords that would signify law, even
at
though
the moment, yes.
Okay. Be strong, do not fear.
Yes, that would be something that you would tell people you're told to tell. Then what would be gospel in this first paragraph?
He's coming with vengeance, terrible recompense.
Yeah, so this
problem.
portion would be gospel. It's not from the gospel, but it's what we would assume with that kind of language. That would be gospel. Okay.
Why does it seem like it contradicts itself? He will come with vengeance.
It's a statement that you're being told that is a promise that will happen. The quotation marks help with that. So this is a statement you're being told to tell people that Isaiah is telling people to say, and it's a promise in that statement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It's just vengeance and recompense sounds like it's, coming for us. But then he says he will come and save you. So
he's just more talking towards the enemies of Israel at this point.
Okay.
And then the rest of it is gospel pretty much as well, because it's a promise of what's going to happen.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a good little warm up for us. As you can see, you have your trigger words. He will come with vengeance. Say to those who are fearful. And the rest of these are things that are almost like reactions after the saying. Eyes of the blind shall be open, lame leap like a deer. These are promises of things to come.
Okay.
Okay, so do we, as of now, answering our question, have any examples for what are the differences between law and gospel? I can give an easy one, that gospel is a promise of things to come.
Okay.
Do you mean from this reading?
From this one specifically, is there anything jumping out at you?
it's just a promise that we need to spread. I mean, that I don't know how to.
So then could we say gospel is something we're supposed to spread? Because this right here,
Yeah.
it says, say to those who are fearful, who are of a fearful heart. You're supposed to say this to them.
Right.
So gospel is something meant to be spread around.
Right. But it's also something that reveals the nature of God and the hope and all that, the positive things, I don't know how to
That's a
express
good
it.
answer. Gospel is something that reveals the nature of God.
Right.
Doesn't gospel break down the loose translation of good news?
Yes, it does. The Greek word for gospel, I believe, is evangelion, which means good news. So all right, and then maybe we could say law is something we're supposed to speak to each other or share with one another. Would that be an appropriate answer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or is it obedience to God in order to, advance the gospel, to spread the gospel? I don't know. I don't know how to express that
That's
either.
actually that's right, because that comes from our discussion last week where we talked about the purpose of law is to bring someone to Christ or the gospel. So if you say the law is a tool in order to spread the gospel, that would make sense.
Okay.
So the law is like the framework in which the gospel exists?
The law is a tool that shows us that it's either A, Old Testament, or B, modern laws. Like the law is all those things. It's basically rules that order society. And then what you're supposed to do is realize that we are imperfect beings. We cannot live up perfectly to those rules, no matter how hard we try. And that directs us then to Christ in the gospel, who offers forgiveness for us not being able to fulfill the law perfectly. I think Dexter's muted, so if he's talking, I can't hear him.
Oh no, I'm digesting what you said. I'm listening to you,
Okay.
brother.
Yeah, those are the two. That's the purpose of law, is to order creation and bring us to Christ. That's what law does. And it does that by showing us we cannot follow the law perfectly. We are unable to do that. Only Christ can. All right, so this one was a relatively easy one. Let's move on to James, which is much longer. Do we have a volunteer to read this one?
Sure.
Okay.
My brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes, and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one who is poor you say, stand there, or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. It is not the rich who oppress you. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For the one who said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead.
Okay. A lot to dissect there. So we heard some keywords like, obviously, law is said multiple times. The royal law, according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is, Kesha, don't do it. Ugh. That is law as well, even though it's in the New Testament. Okay. So we also have things like there's clearly reflections of the 10 Commandments, which are also considered to be law. Don't commit adultery, don't murder. What in this passage gives you an idea of what the law is? No
Well,
wrong answers, just start spitballing.
Well, I would say that the obvious ones are when it's quoted, "You shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder." I think that's the obvious one.
So,
like the 10 Commandments, basically. Right.
So then, could we say the obvious things we're not supposed to do in society would be law? Laws, things we're not supposed to do.
Fair, but I wouldn't say it's always so obvious.
Yeah. I mean, there's the law that our leaders put on there, which may not be the same as God's law, you know.
Or mixed in.
I'm sorry? What'd you say?
I was following up with what you said. I said, or mixed in, like our leaders can say something and more or less like tack it in with what the gospel is saying. So it's like not exactly the same law. Like law of the land and law of the word aren't necessarily one the same.
Right.
Yeah, and that's true, though. They're both law. They're not the same law. All right. But what is gospel in this passage? This is from the New Testament, so there should be some gospel stuff in here. What's going on?
Where was it? I saw one before. I'm trying to find where it was. The part that jumped out at me that I thought fit that was the part that said, "Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters." So really the listen part is kind of invoking the people to kind of hear and follow.
Right.
But it's not really a command.
So the listen is him commanding them to do something. Yes, but then what follows would be gospel.
Right.
Because that's God's promise. God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom. That would be a promise. That would be the promise of gospel. We talked about last week how law, sometimes people don't follow it and they still don't find Christ in that. This would be kind of an example of that situation. If you recall us talking about that last week, Darren. Has not God chosen this? He's not telling them to do something. He's explaining something by using the law as a tool to explain to others. And it's not being said, hey, follow these laws that our society dictates. He's commanding something or something he was commanded to share. And that's what's happening here. Gospel, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith? So what words would best describe that highlighted passage? Could we say it's a promise? It's a prediction? What would those be?
Um,
I might have taken the best ones already.
It's why it's phrased like a question as opposed to more of like a deliberate statement. You know, it's like
So gospel can be phrased as a question instead of a delivery statement.
that's how it appears.
hmm.
Now, of course, we're going to dissect these answers at the end of the month. These are just us getting them out of the way now and thinking of them. So would we say that doing things like dishonoring each other right here when it talks about dishonoring the poor, would those be situations of law or gospel? Or both? There can be some overlap.
I feel like there's some overlap.
To me, it reads like gospel.
Elaborate, Darren.
Well, I mean, you know, again, I might be having a little difficulty fully differentiating law and gospel, but like if you dishonor someone, you know, unless you do it in a certain fashion, that might be a specific law. In a general sense, dishonoring someone is not necessarily breaking a law, but it goes against God's commands.
But God's commands are laws.
Well, not man-made laws is what I'm.
So is that an act of disobeying the gospel, or is that an act of breaking the law?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I view it as disobeying the gospel because that goes against what God would have us do. But, you know, in the sense of man-made law, there would be no man-made, necessarily any man-made punishment for it, if that makes sense.
So 2 seconds. I'm going to close the door so the dogs don't bark. Just kick something hard. I think that was a bone. So can we then say law can have consequences if broken?
Well, definitely, yes.
Yeah, that's a given.
And that's kind of where my thought was reading that one that you suggested. I'm thinking of, you know, if then, you know, if you do this, then this is your consequence.
Okay. Can gospel show us those consequences? Or do we only see that in the law?
Oh no, I think it's fair to say gospel shows us consequences. I mean, if he's telling us more or less like if he's giving us a promise of what's to come, I mean, like sometimes that is the consequence, you know, and like vengeance and recompense is definitely like telling me what's to come, and that's looking at more of the gospel as opposed to a law. So,
but I think to me, part of it also is earthly versus non-earthly. Like when I'm thinking of laws, I'm thinking you have, so to speak, more immediate earthly consequences. Whereas if we disobey God's commands, you know, we may not suffer any consequences here on earth necessarily, but then we will have to account for it possibly later on.
Okay.
Like
So,
we're not going to answer to man-made authorities, but there will come a time when we have to answer to our actions to God.
okay. So law can not. Last week we talked about how there's different tiers of law. There's like earthly law and God's laws. Would there also be different tiers of those consequences? Like God's laws are inescapable, where earthly laws you can kind of bob and weave and dodge them.
Unless we're talking about like driving laws, right? Like the Ten Commandments, don't they just about govern all other laws that we go by? You know, don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat. You know, like those bleed over into our
Yeah.
earthly laws. You know, so it's like the framework for which our earthly laws are founded typically have been grounded in our religious beliefs and things of that nature. You know, and it's still kind of like the basis of to this day, you know. So I'm like, I feel like you get what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, to possibly even further confuse the the scenario, it like to what you said about consequences. You know, you mentioned we can't escape God's law, but I think in a sense people feel that they can escape God's law on earth because there's no direct answering of their actions to God here on earth, whereas you know we answer our earthly authorities such as police, judges, and what have you. But then when the time comes after we leave earth is when we can escape our consequences with God.
But God's playing a long game with his laws. Where
Oh yeah. There you go.
But I think the nature of the consequences is different because if we disobey, if we know God's intention, God's plan for us, and we fail in that, then God still forgives us. And we just miss out on the rewards of having done the right thing. But our earthly laws, they're going to put you in the pokey, really, you know, or kill you, you know. I mean, there is no mercy, you know, when the laws have been set by men and legislatures and stuff like that. There's do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
Oh, I get what you're saying. Yes.
I do, and that's actually the point I was trying to make with saying on earth, I think it's man-made laws is what are in fact inescapable, whereas you know to Lucas's comment about God's law being unescapable, the way he put it was that's more of a long game type of scenario. Once we leave earth, then yeah, we can't escape whatever consequences you know he may give us, but on earth I think it's the man-made laws that are inescapable.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back to what something Cheryl said with the nature of the laws and how earthly laws seem to be a little bit less merciful, where God's law, though they're more I would say inescapable, they offer mercy.
Right.
Let's kind of dissect that a little bit. When I say the nature of the law, what would you say the nature behind specific laws is?
Well, in godly laws, it's for our well-being and for peace and love and all of that, you know, that God wants us to have. And we have a tendency to go for the low-hanging fruit instead, you know, whether it's, you know, in marriage or in doing the right thing, you know, as opposed to what you want to do. I mean, our nature kind of makes us do that, and then we just miss out on the reward that God is trying to give us. Lord knows. missed out on a few of those. But
So is
But I
God's
think-
laws
I
about-
think to answer your question on the nature of man-made law, I would say it is to fit into society.
right.
I would argue that it's more or less a I don't know, like a straightening out point. Like usually when people bottom out, it's like at the very bottom of our earthly law, and that's before you've passed or reached your ultimate judgment on where your soul's going to rest, So it's like I feel more like the earthly law is based in that. It's like just your chance before your ultimate chance. It's like you can screw up now and get burned and figure it out, or continue to dodge and then like land before the book of life, and then it's like this what you've done.
So could you say then, Dexter, natural man-made laws are kind of the testing ground or safety net before you experience judgment?
Yeah, like I said, like earlier when you had mentioned it, you were like, sometimes there's a little overlap, and I'm like, I see how the framework for our laws were grounded in our religious base, and just kind of like mirroring what's been told to us before, through our religious doctrine. It's like, don't do these things. And if you do these things, then you land in court or behind bars. Earthly law isn't just, limited to the prison system or the court system. It's like, there's still a law of the street, like that's still part of earth. That's still earthly law. So it's like, depending on how you've lived and depending on how you're going about things, it's like you could either get scared straight, figure it out, straighten up your life, continue to dodge, or ultimately end and face judgment where it's like you've been given chances, you didn't heed any of them, you've heard my word plenty of time, and here you are. So I feel
So
like, yeah.
when you say things like unwritten laws, like the law of the street, which I wrote down, what would you classify as an unwritten law? Things that we just understand naturally, or are those things we develop through our experiences?
It's like both, there's certain things I feel like you inherently know. And then there's like, all right, well, I had to really mess up in order for me to know how bad that was. It's like, I feel like you already know. It's very rare that you do something that's bad and you're like, oh, I didn't know it was bad. Maybe you were like, I figured it was bad, but I didn't know it would get me in that kind of trouble,
That, unless someone has a comment, is the perfect segue into our gospel reading. Unless someone has a comment they really want to get in. Okay, so then moving on, we're going to look at Mark 7:24 through 37. And it says, from there he set out and went away from the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. And immediately his ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Now, I just preached on this passage this past weekend. This is a passage that some people view with a little bit of conflict and have a hard time digesting, because in this passage, Jesus shows, kind of similarly to what Dexter was talking about, with things we just inherently know, things that we've learned about our communities and the areas we live in, that I would say are like laws of the street. They're not written down, but they're ways of proper conduct. And in this situation, this Syrophoenician woman, who is a Gentile, and Gentiles and Jews are constantly at conflict during this era, Jesus uses a racial slur towards her. He calls her a dog. I talk about in my sermon why Jesus would have done that. Was it intentional? Was it because maybe he's just grown up in a community that was just commonly used and it slipped out? Now, we don't say that Jesus did that because he was an evil asshole and was just trying to be a dick. Or was he using it as a tool to help this woman learn about her salvation? Because this is a salvation story for her, because she responds with, "Sir, even the dogs under the table," kind of giving a clap back to Jesus, showing that there's not so much differences between the two groups of the Jews and Gentiles. So right now in this passage, we're seeing Jesus highlight this messed up law of the street, or internal laws that have been built into these two groups. Gentiles and Jews don't like each other. They use racial slurs against each other, and thus they do terrible things to one another. And Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first." Those will be the children of Israel. Those will be the Jews. That is what most of the Jews and many Gentiles think that the Messiah is going to do. He's going to take care of the Jews first. But then she says the Messiah is here for all of us. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. We all share the same meal, so we're all very similar. And Jesus acknowledges her understanding by immediately healing her daughter. So we are seeing this difference in how things are supposed to be done and what's built into us and how we're supposed to say. And then we also see how innate understanding can be wrong as well. Because up until this point, like I said, Gentiles and Jews are constantly at conflict. They're saying negative things about each other. They discriminate against one another. And Jews naturally think they're better than the Gentiles because they're the chosen people. Here, this chosen man, this Jew, a deaf person, comes forward. Jesus heals him and says, "Don't tell anyone." And what does that guy in the crowd of Jews do? They go forward and they tell everyone. They break that law, that command from Christ. Whereas this woman, she just inherently understands what's going on and doesn't say anything. So in this passage, you can see that reflection of that internal law that we all kind of learn and build upon ourselves. What else in this passage highlights the differences between law and gospel? And possibly, if you want to dissect a little bit further, how those two things can be different depending on your social group or how you were raised, etc. I know that's a lot to dissect.
I don't know, but can I say something from what Pastor Ralph said?
Sure.
Because it struck me that I'd never heard that before, that the Syrophoenician woman was, her prayer was answered basically by Jesus, even though they were from opposite sides and everything. And he was talking about how we might assume that she's going to be a Christian, that she's converted then because she's had this happen to her, but she doesn't. I mean, she stays a Gentile, and that was, that was okay. And so and that we as a church, as a Gentile church, kind of put down the Jewish people and have had holocausts and such, but that God blessed her because her faith was there, and she didn't really have to convert to please him, basically is what
Okay.
I don't know how to explain, but it made sense at the time.
It sounds like what you're saying to me is there are differences between and similarities. There are differences and similarities between being a good person and a good Christian. And you can be one or the other and both while also being one and being bad at the other. That kind of sounds like what I'm hearing from you.
I think it was just that, a lot of the people who believed in Jesus and have looked down on other religions, even though God is working in all of them, I think, I don't know how to explain it. I'm
Well,
sorry.
no, that makes sense because Lutheran theology does say, at least that's what I've been taught, that we do not have all the answers. That we are
Okay.
not the only mode in which God works through us into the world. And
Right.
this woman is kind of highlighting that as well.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Darren, were you about to say something?
Well, I was going to say the way the reading ends of that first part. So she went home, found the child laying on the bed and the demon gone. And then that's the end of that story. We don't really know what came after it. So we don't know if she possibly converted, because of the experience. We don't know if she went and told everybody, like the other person did, because it just ends with her child being healed.
Well, I think Pastor Ralph said, something about he might have known it from other readings or something. I don't know. Have to ask him. I don't know.
We could say, just looking at this section here, how we talked about the law brings people to Christ. This woman is obviously very desperate. She's probably been trying to find ways to heal her daughter for a while, using modes of the law to do that, and it's failed her up until this point. So when she hears about who Jesus is, she comes to him and bows at his feet and is completely just begging for his assistance. So we could say up until this point, she has converted, though conversion means something different then as it does now, because Christians aren't really a thing then. Everyone's still Jewish,
Right.
with a flavor of Jesus. And
but she wasn't Jewish. That was the point.
She wasn't Jewish, no, but Gentiles still could have worshipped the Jewish God, but their ethnicity would not have been Jews. It would have been
right.
Gentiles.
Okay. I wasn't there, so I don't know.
No, it's an interesting thing to play with in like a Bible study. Like we can say this woman was brought to Christ through the law that was not living up to the standards that she needed.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I think sometimes we too often either mix up or meld, or I don't know exactly how I want to say it. I think too often we equate faith and religion as kind of one and the same. Like what I mean by that is whether or not after this experience she called herself Christian does that even matter? Because
No.
the truth of the story is she came to this man because she had faith in who this man was purported to be. He healed her because she had that faith. And the bottom line is she came to Jesus. I think she now believes in him and understands who he is. Like, doesn't matter whether or not
Right.
people call you a Christian.
And he didn't demand that she convert to Judaism or follow him or anything like that. She went back to her people. I don't know what she did there, but she was grateful to God, I'm sure, and lived happily ever after. I
Maybe
don't
not lived happily ever after, but
relatively.
I see what you're saying. Well, yes. So then, Darren, you said too often we confuse faith and following law and things like that. So, are there times where law and gospel can come into conflict?
Yeah, and I think we talked about that last week. Like one of the, I forget what the specific one was, but I remember making a remark where we read something, and I suggested that a lot of times the difference between law and gospel is where they do in fact conflict and don't overlap.
Okay.
And I wish I could remember the example. I don't off the top of my head.
Mhm.
I can't. I know what you're talking about. I can't recall it either. So then, continuing to kind of dissect what we've read, we saw it in our James reading, where it mentions faith without works is dead. Now, we as Lutherans don't believe that good works are what gives salvation. Good works are a side effect of faith, and
Right.
good works are a reflection of your faith out in the world. So, in the gospel reading and in all of our readings today, and I'm kind of sticking with this idea of conflict between law and gospel. Let's focus on that for a little bit. Are there situations in our modern society or in our gospel readings that we could say that person is following the law, but in doing so is not living the gospel and is not living their faith correctly?
Can you repeat the first part? Did you say like today or
Either or. Today or in biblical readings.
Well, I mean, the one that jumps out at me always is when Jesus healed on the Sabbath. You know, a lot of people condemned him for breaking the law when in fact he was doing God's work.
That's a good point. The law said not to do that, and yet Jesus still did it because it was the right thing to do. And then he, I feel like, is also highlighting in that situation the differences between God's law and human law, because he highlights human tradition being something that has corrupted the law from what it was supposed to be, which was helping someone and being there for each other. And yet they chose not to do that just because it was a specific day of the week. That's a good example. I would say that in this situation where you can kind of see conflict and where people can come forward and say, you're not following the gospel, you're breaking the law, and thus being a bad person, et cetera, politics can come into that a lot.
You don't say.
I mean, I'm not going to try to dig too deep and single people out, but like, especially in the previous week, where we've seen a lot of stuff come down the pipes on what's good and what's bad and how the law is supposed to work and how it isn't. We've seen a lot of people, especially like, let's just say the example of the Texas abortion law, come forward and say, that's right, that's God's work. And others have said, no, that's wrong. You're infringing on the rights of others. That's not godly. That's you being a prick. I feel like perspective can really kind of influence and determine what one understands to be God's law or gospel and human law versus gospel.
Right. Yep.
So then, to end on a little bit of an easy note, let's just kind of dissect the second half of our gospel reading, because we kind of focused really hard on that woman. What in this situation with the man who's in Galilee here, across the Sea of Galilee, what would have been law in this situation? What would have been gospel? And you can infer a little bit. That's a hard one. Like, for example, I would say when the people brought this man to him, they did so with the promise that he would be healed. That would have been gospel. And they didn't tell Jesus to heal him. They just hoped that he would. And then you can see law being when Jesus says, don't tell anyone, and yet they do it anyway.
Yeah, look how quickly they broke that one.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we're not perfect. We've all been told by God or in the commandments in some way not to do something, and yet we break it. But then we also see here, then looking to heaven, he yelled that word I can't pronounce, and that means to be opened. I looked up that word and I still couldn't pronounce it. Google did not help me with that one. But that, and like we talked about last week about how a lot of people think, oh, because Jesus said it, it's gospel. Jesus is God. God gives out commands. He's commanding this person's body to be open. This is a clear example of law that Jesus is throwing down. Though it's doing it with divine power, it is worded to look like law. Would you disagree with that?
Isn't he acting on the gospel?
Jesus is acting on the gospel, and he's like the living embodiment of that, but he can still give out law, which is commands, and he's commanding this dude's body to be open, his ears and his tongue.
Beautifully said.
Because after all, God gives commandments, and Jesus is God, so why can't he give commandments? So what in here would have been some, like, let's look at the language very specifically. What would have been gospel and what would have been law? Besides the ones I just highlighted, and immediately his ears were opened. That would have been gospel, because Jesus said this is going to happen, and it did. That was a promise. It's a little bit of a stretch there with the language, but I would argue that is gospel. And then, of course, we have Jesus saying things like, then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but they did it anyways. And here we have a little bit of gospel of what Jesus promises and what Jesus is able to do for them. He's done everything well. He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. That is not them saying, he said this is going, like, we're telling you this is what this is. No, that is something Christ promises that will happen, which we saw in our first reading in Isaiah. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer. The tongue of the speechless will sing for joy. Is that not the exact situation that happened in our gospel reading?
Yes, it is.
So that, like we talked about earlier, is gospel, even though it's not in the Gospels, it was a situation that was promised, and the promise is being shown here.
Yes. Amen.
Amen. Yeah. Sorry, I did a lot of talking in this one. I try not to, but this was a hard one to kind of dissect and figure out the differences and answer our question. But I appreciate y'all bearing with me through this.
Well, we appreciate you.
Well, if anything else pops up in y'all's heads and minds about this question that we're trying to answer, contact me. Let me know.
Certainly will.
Okay, cool.